It's wonderful, excuse me, to see such a nice large crowd for this interesting topic. I'm Diane Tedick from the University of Minnesota, and I'll be introducing the panel members in just a few moments. Let me just start by saying that I'll just give a little bit of background for this. Historically, as you know, immersion programs have, at least in principle, adhered to separation of instructional languages. But in the past decade or so, scholars have begun to challenge this practice, arguing that there's a place for judicious use of the L1 or majority language to support L2 learning and use. And others maintain that clear, sustained separation of languages in immersion instruction remains important. Last night, we heard a wonderful keynote presentation by Meryl Swain offering some guidelines for potential L1 use in the classroom, and there were some very interesting questions that arose. I was speaking with some people at the reception afterward who were very skittish about this, and so I know that this is a very interesting and heated topic for people, and I'm excited about this debate. The purpose is really to just showcase a nice, lively, open, civil debate among scholars and among audience members on this topic. I've invited panelists representing one way first, then two-way, and then Indigenous language immersion. And I've asked each of them to play a role. Let me first introduce them here. Representing one way, second foreign language immersion perspective is Miles Turnbull from the University of Prince Edward Island. He's going to take the pro stance. Stella Kong from the Hong Kong Institute of Education will take the con stance. Then for the two-way perspective, we're hearing from Susan Ballinger, McGill University, and Deb Palmer from the University of Texas at Austin. And then finally, an Indigenous language immersion perspective coming from New Zealand. We have Tauwehe Tamati from the University of Auckland, and Katarina Edmonds, an independent Maori language consultant. So I've asked each of the panelists to play a role for the beginning part of the debate. So imagine, let's consider that pro and con perspectives on this topic lie on a continuum. What's true is that I think many of us are somewhere along that continuum, not one end of the, one extreme end or the other, but I'm asking them to take the role of one extreme end or the other to just get us started. And so this is not necessarily the perspective they hold in reality. So I just want to make that very clear. They've been very, very, they're really being great team players to play along with how I wanted to initially set this up. And their real views will likely come out as the debate proceeds. There will be some time for that. Okay, so let me explain how this is going to, whoops. Yeah, no, that's what I wanted to do, sorry. So I'm giving the opening statement now. We've already got a little bit of a late start because of the technology glitch. But we're going to hear first from our one-way folks. Miles will have 10 minutes to give his perspective. Stella will follow that, and then there will be a few minutes, 5 minutes or so, among panelists to raise questions, ask for clarification, offer additional comments, and the same will proceed with then the two-way perspectives and the Indigenous perspectives. After we finish that opening part of the debate, we will have time for the panelists to continue the debate, and that's where they're stepping out of their initially assigned roles and becoming who they are so that they can share their perspectives, and I hope to weigh in as well. And then we'll have the last half hour to include the entire audience so that we can engage you as well. Everybody clear on how this is going to go? Okay? All right, Miles, if you'd get us started.
Okay. Can you hear me? Not really. Better. Our sound guard's adjusting. Thanks, Diane, and thanks for inviting me to this great conference and to this panel, which I think may prove to be quite a lively debate. I look forward to our dialogue on a topic that has been a passion for me as teacher, researcher, and teacher educator for a long time. So let me tell you about last night. I was at Merrill's plenary. I was surrounded by a bunch of 5 or 6 Canadians, and I could sense their angst. As Merrill, not about the quality of the talk, but about the topic itself. I think it's fair to say that this kind of open debate and dialogue in many, especially professional circles in immersion education in Canada, might not easily happen. So I think it has to happen in Canada and elsewhere to help us improve immersion education at home and beyond. So I congratulate the conference organizers for having the courage and foresight for making this controversial theme front and center during this conference. So Diane has assigned me the permissive position in one-way immersion. One-way immersion is what I know, French immersion in Canada. And as for permissive, well, even a few years ago, that would have been quite a stretch for me. I was quite a purist in favor of exclusive, and I mean exclusive target language use. I now refer to myself as a recovering purist. So, those of you who know our edited volume, Turnbull and Daily OK in 2009, will know that this is also a logical position for me, since in the conclusion of that book, my co-editor and I argue for and launch a definition of optimal L1 use in second and foreign language learning. And I'm going to ask Diane to put it on the screen, and I'll just let you read it yourself. So I am indeed permissive, related to L1 use, with caveats, but I'm going to try to do the acting role that I've been assigned, and we'll try to be totally pro L1. I'm not sure that I really have accomplished that, but we'll see. I also want to say that since our 2009 book was published, Marianne Cormier, Jimmy Bourque, and I published a paper in 2012 in the MLJ in which we provide quantitative data to support student use of L1 to learn science content and to benefit students' French skills. We draw on this definition of optimal L1 use, and the design of our intervention in this quasi-experimental study draws on theories and strategies of literacy development in the target language. And we cite authors such as Lemke, 1990, Norris and Phillips, 2003, Wellington and Osborne, 2001, Giesson, and 2003, and Nadon, 2002. One key and fundamental principle of this literacy development is the importance of building on prior knowledge. In our one-way immersion context in this study, the L1 was common for all learners and constituted a significant source of prior linguistic and content knowledge for the learners. We believe that denying students access to this significant prior knowledge in their L1, be it from their own linguistic repertoire and world knowledge in the L1, or via at least some strategic use of the L1 by the teacher, seemed counterintuitive, contradicted the literacy approach upon which the study was built, and is certainly not in the best interest of students' language, content learning, and affect during the learning process. After hearing Merrill speak last night, I so wished that we had tape recorded the teacher and learning dialogue during the instruction to be able to trace the nature of that dialogue in terms of L1 and L2 use and its effect on content and language development. But we live and learn. Okay, so let me back up a bit and review what we know about, I think we know about L1 use and its role in second and foreign language development process. So no matter what the classroom rules, i.e., if we say explicitly to students that L1 is permitted in class or not, learners use and draw on the L1. We have observational studies, Ballinger and Lister, 2011, Broner and Tedick, 2011, Swain and Lapkin, 2000, Bay and Turnbull and Speck, 1997, from immersion contexts. Others, Brooks and Donato, Anton and DiCamilla, oh my, and self-report studies on learner beliefs about L1 and target language use. that demonstrate this. Now to teachers. Teachers' use of the L1 in second language foreign contexts, especially in immersion programs, remains more controversial than students' L1 use, in my mind. But why? Of course, there's the input argument. Sorry to use that word, Meryl. And no one can deny the importance of exposure to as much target language input as possible. And there is empirical evidence, albeit old and not from immersion contexts, to demonstrate a clear link between teacher target language use and learner success in the target language. Carroll 75, Bristol 74, Wolf 77. However, no work, to my knowledge, suggests that exclusive target language use by teachers is required or is better than optimal or purposeful teacher use of the L1, as long as the students are still exposed to adequate target language input and are involved in meaningful oral and written output activities in the target language, because we know input is not enough. When the teachers use the L1 selectively and strategically, or purposefully, to quote Swain's third principle from last night, especially when the cognitive challenge of content such as certain science concepts or some grammatical concepts, or ZPD activity, to use Swain's terms, I believe that this small amount of L1 can help ensure that the target language input becomes intake and therefore contributes to target language development or content development. Moreover, I think we need to think about the teacher skills in the target language and the teacher as model target language user. Here we make assumptions that the teacher is indeed an advanced user of the target language and normally bi or multilingual. There is ample evidence from sociolinguists, Lee 2000, Gompers and Cook Gompers 2005, the list goes on, to show that code switching among the languages the one knows is common, even in language classrooms and by language teachers. This code switching serves many discourse-related and organizational functions to structure classroom talk, but also important identity-related functions that are part of being a bi or multilingual language user. So Jenny and I, and others such as Gramsch 2009, Makarot 7 and 9, Levine 9 and 11, argue that allowing natural code switching as part of the learning process in the second and foreign language classroom by both teachers and learners is optimal. But I'm not arguing that we should teach how to code switch per se, and I'm certainly not suggesting that mixed code or translanguage code a la Garcia be accepted in student oral and written production that is assessed. I also want to note the practical complexities of all of this. Some of it doesn't work well in practice when students have different L1s and when the teacher does not share the student's L1 or L1s. However, it's not impossible for teachers to allow or facilitate students with the same L1 to work together, or at least sometimes, as long as there are at least two of them in the class. And of course, students will still draw on their L1 on their own, silently, or in their inner voice, or through bilingual dictionary use, no matter whether there are 2 or 15 users of that language in the classroom. This points to context and at how it changes implementation. It seems clear to me that a one-size theory or policy does not fit all. When it comes to teacher use of L1, no matter how beneficial a small amount of purposeful L1 might be, it's challenging when the teacher does not have any knowledge, skills of the L1 or the L1s of the learners. But sometimes the teacher is a user of one or some of the students' L1s, but not all. Is it inequitable and perhaps unethical to favor one learner over another if the teacher does not know that L1 but not others? Or would this be a perfect example of differentiated instruction? It might be more defensible and feasible for the teacher who cannot say or write any L1 to acknowledge the student's L1 and cultural identity and to allow natural code switching to talk about their inner language voices, which Commons argues is a human rights issue. So let me just, I have 2 seconds left. So to sum up, what is clear to me is that selective or purposeful L1 use in immersion or second and foreign language classrooms is not easy for teachers or learners to manage, but neither is exclusive target language use. And there is evidence, ample evidence really, that some L1 is necessary, natural, and useful for learning and for identity development as a bi- or multilingual language user. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm speaking, I'm taking the am I taking a con side? Yes, I'm taking a con side. And I'll just introduce a bit the perspective from which I'm speaking. I work as a language immersion, a language teacher educator and an immersion teacher educator, and that's in the Hong Kong context. And just you can see that before that, I titled the whole thing as in Hong Kong and also in the Asian context, because we share, I think, within the Asian context, we share a bit of the same language issues that I'm going to talk about. So I'm involved in professional development with immersion teachers. Immersion teachers in Hong Kong and actually also in a lot of Asian countries are not by choice. They just find themselves within the system. So they have to do it. Very much against their will. So working within that context, and the fact that the immersion teachers, we're talking about late immersion here, where the subject content matters a lot, and the immersion teachers are subject trained, but not language trained. They have, the immersion training is not compulsory at all. So working with teachers like this, we feel that these teachers need some very simple and uncontroversial guidance to the language use within their teaching context. So I'll explain a bit about the complications of the language issue in Hong Kong immersion. Well, I hope you can see that, sorry. That immersion teachers' success in Hong Kong is very much assessed by the students' subject scores. The students' language proficiency is irrelevant in assessing the teacher's performance in the high-stakes exam. So here's a communication that I have with a maths teacher. He's saying that, well, whether my contract will be extended depends on how well my students are doing in mathematics, not in English at all. So why should I be bothered with the English? And so with a lot of these teachers, if they find it difficult to explain the subject content in English, they automatically switch it to the first language. So that's one issue that we're dealing with. Then immersion, the use of English in Hong Kong situation, is very much a socio-political issue more than an educational issue, in that, well, in Hong Kong at least, and I guess in some Asian countries as well, that English immersion is seen as better schools because English is an economic tool within the society. So all parents feel that if their kids don't get into an English medium school, they're not going to have a good future. So in terms of that, once the kids get into an English medium school, actually both the teachers and the students and even the parents don't care very much whether English is used or not. You know, as long as they get into an English medium school, known as English medium, that's fine. And so again, we need proper guidelines or useful, uncontroversial guidelines for the teachers. The teachers that we're working with also lack the professional judgment as to what we mean by judicious use of L1. If we mention the use of L1, then we've seen cases where 5% becomes 10% and 10% becomes 15% and so on and so forth, and then you lose the language. The other thing is the use of mixed code is very common in a lot of English medium classrooms. Basically, use of mixed codes means that it's the English lexicons that are used, and the rest of the talk will be in the first language. And that's not immersion at all if they do it that way. And then the students actually come into immersion, because this is late immersion, they come into immersion with rather modest levels of English. of the second language. So they need a lot of exposure to the second language to be, to get up to the level where they can study through the language. So we're working with teachers in this context, so we need very clear advice, clear guidelines for the teachers. So I'm going to say a little bit more about the mixed code thing, and then the students' language. So this is a quote from the last governor of Hong Kong, and he's commenting that we're using Chinglish rather than English, and that's a very negative comment. So then in a study by Angeline, she's saying that class code switching plays a role in education, that between the teachers and the students, this is a way to allow access for some lower socioeconomic status students to the high-level dominant language of English. And that plays a social role, the use of L1 in the English medium classrooms make the teachers and students get closer together. It also helps teachers to do classroom management better, and it actually helps students to develop their academic knowledge. Well, having that view is one perspective, but that might be at the expense of students' learning. So if you're using mixed code like that, are students actually learning very much in terms of the language, in terms of the subject knowledge, and even in terms of their first language? And there seems to be an assumption that the students can't learn well in their first language, but why not? If they learn fully in the first language and then fully either way, either Chinese medium or English medium, they might actually learn better at the end of the day. Interactions, the use of language within Hong Kong classrooms, mainly, as we can see, is always teacher talk, and the teacher also use the first language quite a lot. Same with the students. Another study shows that the students lack the linguistic resources to actually answer any questions from the teacher. So the teacher ends up using a funnel effect of asking questions, so that the student only have to say yes or no as an answer, or just make a choice between two given answers as a way to answer questions. Now that's not very conducive to either learning or second language learning. So the students cannot develop sufficient L2 within a context like this to really learn well through the second language. And that's why we feel that advising the teachers to use full English, full and consistent English, may be a more useful way to help the students to get up to the L2 level in order to learn the language and the subject well. Studies of results of immersion education in Hong Kong shows that it's not working very well, that it has negative effects on their content learning. And English medium students are better students. They are in Band 1 schools. Schools are ranked as Band 1, Band 2, Band 3. And yet, studies have also shown that in terms of content learning in science, the Chinese medium students are doing better than the English medium students. And that is probably because of the use of inconsistent use of L2 in the classroom. So Hopkins says that there are two main factors in determining the MOI in the Hong Kong situation. One is the role of outside vested interests. That's what I mean by the socio-political issues rather than educational. And the other thing is the shortfall in language teaching expertise. And that's why we feel that in terms of that, then we need to give advice to these immersion teachers so that they can use the L2 consistently in the classroom for the sake of students' learning. And lastly, as I said, that's the Hong Kong situation, but actually the Hong Kong situation is very much sort of shared in some other Asian contexts. So in terms of that, then we feel that maybe in contexts like this, advice to teachers to use the L2 consistently is more helpful to them. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for the panel to comments based on those perspectives or raise questions for clarification or other purposes?
So this works, right? Okay. One thing that strikes me is how very much it matters what context you are in. And I wonder if either panelist wants to elaborate further on that, because the French immersion context in Canada seems so drastically different from the Hong Kong context of English immersion in terms of the sociopolitical and the motivations for starting immersion programs, the motivations for placing children into them. And that seems to matter tremendously in what ends up being important.
Well, I think I did say context is quite crucial. And in Canada, for example, some of the complications, parents are choosing to place their children in French immersion with the expectation that they achieve the same content outcomes as students in a regular English program, and that they attain high-level proficiency, often told that they achieve bilingual proficiency when they don't, on most measures of bilingualism. But I can tell you, I'll just tell you about, in certain contexts where the expectation, the content expectations of parents has an impact on target language use and teacher practices. In one study that McGill and Turnbull, 2009, although not reported because some sensitivity around a particular issue, there was parental pressure in this particular context for the teacher to use, there was one teacher who felt very strongly about teaching in the target language only. And there was parental pressure for her not to speak more English. And that parental pressure then affected the principal, who came to put pressure on the teacher. The parents were concerned that students were not getting good grades and not succeeding in science and math, and were disappointed and put pressure. So lots of sociopolitical stuff going on in Canada. One of the reasons why this topic is also very sensitive in Canada is because of the sociopolitical connotations of assimilative kind of fears in Canada around this issue.
I guess I've sort of made the context from which I speak pretty clear. It's basically the inadequate level of L2 at the level of the students, and the need for the students to gain the high level in L2 pretty quickly, especially during the lower forms. Because if they don't, when they get up to the senior forms, they will have much more problems. So it's better for the teachers at the junior forms, and junior, by junior I mean secondary junior, to get as much English as they can within that time, so that their English level get up to the content level, so that the proficiency gap is narrower. So by the time they get to senior forms, they can use the L2 to really study through the language. But actually, personally, I do believe in the judicious use of L1 to learn L2. But I guess the advice that we give teachers is always that the students can use the first language to learn, but the teachers themselves should stick to the second language. Because otherwise, as I said, 5% becomes 10, 10 becomes 15, etc.
Well, it strikes me that in Hong Kong, one of your serious issues is that you have a lot of immersion teachers without immersion teaching training. They are untrained in language issues. And so you're looking for a simple message to give them when it's not a simple problem.
Quite. Okay, we're going to stop there. I'm the taskmaster, as has been established already. Yeah, Susan, I'm going to move this down here. Susan would rather be down here to give her perspective.
Face you. While you look there, I can look at you. Okay, so I'm very happy to have this opportunity. I want to just thank you, Dee, for giving me this opportunity to speak in this symposium. and for giving me the easiest assignment here today, which is to argue the case for using the majority language in two-way immersion. Just to give you an idea of what my background is before I start, I did my master's research in a two-way immersion program in the United States, an English-Spanish program, looking at students' language use in the program. And I ended up also looking at teachers' language use in the program, surprisingly. And since then, I've also had the opportunity to work with Roy Lister on a couple of projects in French immersion and to do my own doctoral work in French immersion in Canada, in the Montreal area, where it's actually is like two-way immersion in many respects because because of the presence of both English and French dominant students in the classroom. So I'm going to be drawing on those two experiences in this argument that I'm making. So a moment ago, I just made a very sarcastic comment in saying that this was the easiest assignment. As we know, the use of the majority language, at least from the perspective of how students use the majority language in two-way immersion, is very problematic. Although two-way immersion has as one of its primary goals to give an equal amount of emphasis to both to both the majority language and the minority language, studies of students' English use, the majority language use being English in North America, has shown that they have a distinct preference for using it. And it's not just the majority language speakers, it's also the minority language speakers. And this, in my own research, what I found was that this begins after about 1 year of being in the program. I was looking at Spanish speakers, heavily dominant Spanish speakers. After about a year, they were not only using English, but when I interviewed grade 1 students who had begun kindergarten as Spanish dominant, and I asked them, why are you speaking English so much? They would say, because English is cool, English is better. That's not a goal of two-way immersion. Certainly, so this is quite a difficult and squeamish topic for me to say that, no, actually, we need to take advantage of the majority language and make it work for us in two-way immersion. All right, so just to quickly tell you, I've put the title of this slide is The Reality of English Use with the question mark, because this was the reality at one school that I observed among the teachers that I observed in one time frame. Nevertheless, what I saw was that for 3 out of the 6 teachers at this school, they were using English moderately to extensively with their students during Spanish time. Both of the grade 1 teachers did it, and one of the grade 8 teachers was teaching, as she called it, bilingually. She was code mixing and code switching in the classroom with the students extensively on purpose. It was her decision, and she was also allowing the students to do that. Now, I was quite shocked to find this, but over time I started to say, maybe there's some lesson here. Maybe these teachers have a valid reason for doing this because they're highly experienced and they are effective teachers as well, thoughtful, intelligent teachers. So for the early years, what I started to realize was that these students, in many respects, they're a bit like foreign language students, right? They're coming into the majority language speakers, I want to say, the dominant majority language speakers. They're coming into the program and they're suddenly immersed in this language, and their teachers, I realized, they're actually using the majority language with them in the same way that Cook has recommended that teachers use the L1 in foreign language contexts. They were using it to convey meaning to the students, to make sure that they understood what their students were saying, for classroom management, and certainly to have an emotional connection with their students. As they told me, they had tried for many years to use only Spanish with their students, and their students often fell apart on them emotionally through frustration. They lost control of their classrooms. So perhaps we do need to reconsider this and to think that maybe we need to start saying that in the early years, using the majority language judiciously is not something that we want to make teachers feel guilty about doing, because I think probably there are many teachers who do it. Certainly allowing these English or majority language dominant students to use English to a great extent in the classroom should be accepted, but also we need to leave it up to teachers, to their judgment, to when and how they should push these students to use the majority language, to the minority language in their classroom based on their abilities, their personality, how much they're willing to take risks, etc. Certainly routines, whole class activities should be done in the minority language. Take out your pens, greetings, songs, those kind of things. Whole class discussions should continue to be in the minority language. But if teachers need to stop their class for a moment and give a brief explanation of vocabulary in the majority language, to give clarifications, to go one-on-one with students, I don't think they need to have a guilty complex about that. The grade 8 math teacher that I observed, it was a very different context, and she brought up very different issues related to using the majority language. As I said, she was using this language bilingually, and her reasoning for doing that was that she said that students are academically dominant in the majority language by the later years, and they need to use it as a tool to make sense of more complex material, such as problem solving in math. I think this really touches on a lot of what what Swain was talking about yesterday. It certainly touches on Swain and Lapkin, Anton and DiCamillo, where they've made the point that, yes, students do sometimes need to use their L1 or their dominant language, and that may be the majority language for some students. It may be their academically dominant language to problem solve in peer interaction moments. However, she was also allowing students to speak to her in using code mixing and code switching in the classroom, which I think, at least from her perspective, may be reflective of this idea of translanguaging. These students were students who spoke bilingually outside of the classroom as well. They code switched and code mixed constantly with each other, and I think that she felt quite comfortable in allowing them to do that in the classroom with each other, but also with her. And I'm not going to say anything else about that, although I have a lot more that I could say. I'm going to skip that slide, in fact, because I'm trying to argue one point. Anyway, so moving on to what I've done in more recent years, another form of judicious use of the majority language in these classrooms is making use of one language, making ties between the two languages by linking vocabulary, linking similar concepts related to vocabulary across the languages when they exist, highlighting key differences between majority and minority grammatical structures to help students with common problems they may have, also bringing in themes that are being discussed in the other classroom, and these are things that Roy Lister will talk about at great length in his plenary tomorrow. But this is a way that you can use the majority language as a tool in the classroom without reducing the amount of exposure and the practice of the minority language in the classroom. And this is something that I stand behind very strongly. Yet another final way that I want to just give you a concrete idea on how to do this is that you could actually create portfolios, projects, where across the languages, where students might be bringing in this portfolio with work that they've done to prepare for, like a pre-writing task they've done in the majority language to help them take the next step and write another draft in the minority language. So you're physically bringing the majority language into the minority language classroom, but you're not reducing students' minority language exposure. So quickly, I just want to summarize my points that I've made. I talked about the judicious use of majority language in the early years and how it may be similar to the level of L1 use that's been prescribed in foreign language classrooms. Perhaps students who have over time become academically dominant in the majority language, they may need to use that language in the minority language classroom to work on cognitively complex ideas with their peers. Although questions still persist regarding whether teachers and students should interact monolingually or bilingually, as was done with this one teacher, I think that's something we certainly need to explore. Do we want to make code switching a goal in our classrooms, in our bilingual classrooms? And finally, I just want to put forth again that it's not necessary to speak the majority language extensively in order to make use of it to support overall language development.
We'll hear from Deb Palmer now. Do you want to come here? Okay.
Yeah, I want to be down here. So let's see, I've been asked to represent a position that opposes the use of the target language or other language instructional time in two-way dual language contexts. So I have to admit this is a challenging one for me, given the paper I'll be presenting tomorrow with two of my doctoral students is exploring a potential alternative to strict language separation. That said, however, I do have something to say. As for many of the people on this panel, the question has been a really important one for me throughout my career. Ever since I was a teacher in a 90-10 two-way dual language program in Northern California with a very strict policy of language separation, my struggle to maintain our school's language policy with my fourth graders, especially during Spanish time, was one of the issues that actually drove me to graduate school in 1999. And I remember in 2001, my second year in graduate school, attending a talk at AERA given by Maria de la Luz Reyes from University of Colorado Boulder, representing the spontaneous biliteracy acquisition of 4 emergent bilingual students in a two-way dual language context in Colorado. At the end, I boldly, if somewhat unwittingly, raised my hand to ask essentially, how did they manage to convince the children to willingly embrace Spanish literacy? And I shared that I had struggled to get my English speakers to speak in Spanish during Spanish instructional time, no matter how strict I got with language separation. Well, my bringing up language separation seemed to hit a trigger, and Reyes told me in no uncertain terms that such language separation was unnatural and unnecessary, and that I should support my students' development of biliteracy through a fluid engagement with both languages. This seems entirely true for a classroom full of heritage language speakers. Bilinguals do flow between their languages and engage in a beautiful range of hybrid language practices, and these practices are excellent tools for the acquisition of academic registers. Contrary to some arguments that were presented to me as a new dual language teacher, children do not grow confused when presented with literacy in 2 languages at once. They can acquire 2 linguistic systems simultaneously and joyously, and Reyes' work, plus a great deal of other work in the field of biliteracy since then, have clearly demonstrated this. But the response was still deeply unsatisfying to me, primarily because I sensed that in my particular context in Northern California, with half my class full of English speakers who were primarily white and middle class, English dominance was such an issue that I simply couldn't ignore it. It seemed to me, if I ignored it, then English speakers and the English language would get all of the attention, and Spanish language development in my classroom for everyone would suffer. And indeed, when I went on to my dissertation research, I was able to document and demonstrate that accomplishing bilingualism is not, at least not always, that simple. As Guadalupe Valdez asserted in 1997, the famous Harvard Ed Review article, diversity is a challenge, and in diverse contexts, unless we pay special attention to hegemonic discourses, they will win. So how can we ensure then that speakers of non-English target languages get an equitable shot at learning and communicating in two-way dual language classrooms? How can we balance the linguistic field, offer speakers of non-dominant languages equal chances at the floor in the classroom, ensure that discourses include the patterns most comfortable for speakers who come from non-middle class, non-English speaking backgrounds, and of course make a two-way dual language classroom a place for everyone to learn powerful bilingual skills? There's no doubt that English is the dominant language in the United States. This is evident to anyone who lives in the United States. There are many pockets where other languages hold status, and many communities that engage in healthy bilingualism, but almost everyone agrees it is difficult to live in the United States if you do not speak English in some ways. The English-only movement does not seem to be weakening. Over something like 30 states now have declared English as their official language. 3 states have outlawed bilingual education, and nearly every class in every institution of higher education in the country is conducted at least partially, if not fully, in English. And of course, English is more and more considered an international language of communication. It's therefore a difficult case to make to children in school, that it's worth the investment to become highly competent in a language other than English, even with large enclaves of immigrants and heritage speakers of a wide range of languages. And until recently, public K-12 schooling appeared to make little effort to encourage such bilingual competencies, playing instead into those hegemonic discourses around English by supporting compensatory models of bilingual education and by frequently equating academic learning with learning in English only. Dual language, of course, is the unique exception. And the beauty of dual language, the thing that has attracted me to it since I moved into bilingual education in the mid-1990s, is the way it works
to disrupt the hegemony of English. Dual language has the audacity to suggest that it's worth the investment for children to become academically competent in 2 or more languages, and it takes a global perspective on multilingualism, radically integrating classrooms. This is a project I've always thought worth working on. So then when you get inside of a dual language classroom, a 2-way dual language classroom, what do you see? Well, programs vary tremendously and are increasingly varied in terms of the populations they serve, but you do see diversity. You see linguistic, cultural, race, class, academic, all kinds of dimensions of diversity in these classrooms. And you see some tipping of the balance scales, at least when compared with transitional, bilingual, or structured English immersion segregated classrooms. You see native English speakers turning to their immigrant target language speaking classmates for help, understanding the teacher's instructions. You see a broad range of life experiences. In many programs, you see the influx of a new set of, shall we call them, globally minded and often highly educated and resourced parents who are suddenly invested in bilingual programs in urban public schools. These are certainly supportive aspects of 2-way dual language, but as I'm sure you're expecting I'll say, it's not all that simple. It's not enough just to put them all in one room. English-dominant children, not surprisingly, speak a lot of English in the classroom. They enter the classroom with the assumption that everyone there will understand their English, and pretty soon they're often correct. They choose English for a range of reasons, and it's a challenge to convince them to choose Spanish. I was not alone in sensing this when I was in the classroom as a 4th grade 2-way dual language teacher. If they are from an educated middle-class family, they also dominate the discourse, whether they're working in English or Spanish or whatever. Middle-class speakers of the dominant language seem to have a certain discourse habit in common with their mostly middle-class teachers, and to have learned certain habits in their homes that allow them more access to the floor in school, especially during whole group interaction. Without intervention, these children get greater access to the teacher and more opportunities to participate in classroom activities and discussions. Finally, at least in some documented cases, English-speaking children appear to influence the kind of Spanish or target language that's spoken in the classroom. They require a sheltered Spanish that seems to water down Spanish language instructional time. And for some reason, this is less likely to happen during English instruction, in spite of the same needs on the part of the minority language speakers. These are all manifestations of the hegemony of English in the world outside the classroom. And it shouldn't surprise anyone that these patterns merely echo the kinds of patterns that children and teachers live within. So what can mitigate English and English speaker dominance in 2-way dual language classrooms? Well, my belief is that there's nothing better than a teacher with critical awareness of these issues. When we live in diverse communities, we need to learn new patterns that promote equity. These are good lessons for life. A teacher who knows about the potential dominance of English in the classroom can learn to notice the little moments when intervention can help balance the equation. And one thing such a teacher might try to do is to protect a space or a time in the classroom for the development of the target language. Guarding the boundaries of such a space or time may entail a teacher explicitly limiting the role of English in the classroom, or at least trying to. I have to point out that often explicit limitations set on children in the classroom about language use have been shown to be moderately to somewhat ineffective. In other words, I want to say it doesn't so much seem to matter which languages we tell children to use as which languages they actually choose to use and for what purposes. And that is ultimately what determines the extent and flavor of their bilingualism and biliteracy. And children's investments in learning languages, like those of language learners of any age, are complex and highly agentic. So to tell the truth, I think it's time we get more sophisticated in our strategies for encouraging learners' investments in bilingual and biliterate identities. And I'd say to tune in tomorrow for more of our thinking about these kinds of things.
Okay, now some time for panelists to ask questions or offer some comments based on those perspectives.
Such a lively panel.
Well, maybe I do. Probably my question is, listening to everyone, it's my colleagues who have spoken before me.
Could you get a little closer to the mic, please? I think, yeah, thank you.
Everyone who's speaking, am I right in assuming the majority language we're talking about is English or French? Yeah. not French?
Just
English, just English. So I just want to ask the panel, when neither of us has spoken yet, what it seems to me it's very assimilative. It's all about assimilating everyone to speaking English. And what are your thoughts on the those heritage languages that these students might bring to your classes? I've just heard about providing a protected space, and I'm thinking, no, I don't want to be preserved. So could maybe the panel offer some thoughts on what is their thinking before I get up and tell you all about being Māori? What are your thoughts about a continued assimilation of students into English?
One thing that's been troubling me at this conference is what kinds of language we use to talk about the different languages we're talking about. And we were talking before the panel about that very question. The title of this symposium is L1, or Majority Language. And I was at a panel this morning where they were talking about a two-way dual language context, and at one point somebody asked, so was the lesson in L1? Well, in a two-way dual language context, there are at least two L1s. So which is one? And in Texas in particular, a lot of our students walk in the door with a bilingual competency. So their L1 is really both languages that they walk in with, if not three in some cases or more. So it's problematic to me the way we talk about it. I think we need to keep troubling that, and we need to keep looking for new ways to talk about the different languages we're talking about. So I don't know if that directly addresses, but it's on the same lines.
Deborah, you referred to teacher preparation and teacher critical awareness, and I couldn't agree more. Developing that critical awareness is easier said than done. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for leading teachers to be open to developing critical awareness.
This is something I've actually tried really hard to get my head around. I would like someday to develop a sort of institute for teachers to learn the discourse patterns that go on in multilingual classrooms, and to try to use those patterns to the advantage of learning for all kids, to be aware of the inequities. One thing that's been helpful to me lately is identity theory. There are some constructs within identity theory that seem to me that if teachers could be made more aware of them, they could use them. One such idea is the idea of positioning. Potowski uses this in her study. Investment is a concept that is a little bit more complex than motivation for understanding why kids choose languages, and it has to do with their own agency and their own position in the world. And I think if teachers could understand investment as opposed to motivation, they might be able to set things up in the classroom, you know, to more advantage kids to choose the both bilingual identities. And similarly, positioning or continuing to place kids in a position of being bilingual until they actually are might be if teachers could be made aware of sort of these complexities with these strategies, but I haven't tried it out yet.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move to our last duo here with Tauwehe taking a pro stance for Indigenous language immersion.
Tuatahi, kei te mihi atu hau ki a tātou, koe hui mai nei. Just a general greeting to everyone here, and the slide really says it all about who I am, except to say that I've been working in the Māori immersion program for about 16 years at the University of Auckland. So I'm going to be talking to you today about the Māori language immersion schools in New Zealand that we commonly call kura kaupapa Māori. And in preparing for you today, I wanted to pose questions throughout my presentation. The first for you, a very international audience, how were these Māori language immersion schools established? in our very English mainstream program. Here we have, I'll let you look at the slide, it dates back to legislation in 1989 that was passed through Parliament with a great deal of struggle, I want to add, from our people for exactly the reason noted there. That is to address the survival and revival of our language, our heritage language, and also twin goals there to address under achievement of our children in English medium, the English medium schools. I also want to refer to our Kura Kaupapa Māori commitment. All our schools nationally of Kura Kaupapa Māori are committed to the philosophical foundation document, which we refer to as Te Aho Matua. So my next question then is, what provision has been made for English language instruction, the majority language in our country, in our Māori medium schools, Kura Kaupapa Māori? And whilst there is a legal requirement and our Education Review Office people are responsible for moving around our kura kaupapa and looking for compliance according to this, I also want to read that in the working group back in 1989 that was set up to look at the first Kura Kaupapa Māori, they wrote in their report that bicultural and bilingual citizens was the goal in terms of our graduates of our Kura Kaupapa schools. Then again in 1990, Professor Reedy, again and referring to the original Kura Kaupapa Māori language immersion schools, wrote, "Children who have a bicultural, bilingual upbringing will not be hampered in their educational achievements nor in their future as adults." So there was always, not only in law, but I think from the beginning, there was always thinking around a place for English in the total immersion Māori schools we call Kura Kaupapa Māori. Now, about toward the end of the 1990s, there was a change, I guess, in practice. From what I'm saying, the English will happen automatically thinking to the separate language approach, which is pretty well how things are now. And I think it's fair to say in the beginning it was there were thinking that because English is the majority language in our country, that it would happen automatically. But since then, as I said, since the end of the 1990s, we've been more strategic in the Kura Kaupapa Māori in terms of separate zones for the Māori language and then for the English language. And we're looking typically at around 80-20, 90-10. So 10% for English, the majority language, or 20% across the whole Māori language immersion program in each school. So what are the issues surrounding this separate language approach, looking at the target language, the Māori language for most of the time, about 80% of the time, 90% of the time, and then what are the issues around English, that English component within those contexts? Okay, recent work by colleagues Berriman and Glynn have picked up on the ad hoc kind of inconsistent traditional practices within our kura, within our Māori immersion schools in terms of moving from the Māori language for our children across to English. And I want to say that we're talking about children in our Māori medium schools, kura kaupapa Māori, who begin at 5, and after about 6 years, when they're around, say, 11, 12, most of our schools are looking at transitioning then from the Māori language into the English language in some way. But as I said, research literature is saying that at this stage it's ad hoc, and the practices are somewhat consistent right across the sector. And in the absence of that, the research is saying that there is no monitoring around these practices or evidence to develop effective transitional practices from Māori to English for these children, and the discussion, as we've taken for granted here, isn't quite happening. There's no bringing together of professionals to talk this through. So my job, I need to say that I'm completing my PhD in this very area through the University of Auckland, and my question to, in terms of thinking about the topic was, okay, what would a kaupapa Māori approach to English instruction look like in our own Māori immersion schools? And it was not only easier but safer for me to, I guess, refer to where I come from, and I come from a bush, forested region, and my tribe is Tauwehe, and in our tribe a cultural metaphor, a very important cultural metaphor, is around this particular type of tree. The name of the tree is the kahikatea tree, and there's a photo of them. And they grow tall and straight, but more particularly they grow together. And their root system, not only on top of the earth, but underneath, is just a tangled web. And here, in my thinking or theorising my own practice, I started thinking about linguistic individuality represented in each tree, in the grove of trees, and then the interdependence of those trees in terms of the root system, the collectiveness of the root system. We get big winds where I come from, but the kahikatea, even though, as you can, I hope you can see there, they're tall and straight, not kind of bushy, it's the root system and the collective strength of the tree grove that prevents them from being blown over. I had a problem with thinking about, well, what am I going to call this cultural metaphor kind of pedagogical practice that's swirling around in my head around trees. So it was easy to think of it in Māori. It's just simple, it's te ara kahikatea. And I played with words and I came up for an English equivalent, and I've called it the trans-acquisitional approach to English instruction in kura kaupapa Māori. And there I'm looking at the learners' metalinguistic skills and maximising the reciprocal flow, this reciprocal flow of concepts in the learners. And I'm comparing the root system to that kind of connection of metalinguistic concepts and transfer. I'm not looking at just open slather, code switching. I'm looking to systemise it, to box it in, to call it a model and call it an approach. And I'm working around 3 phases in that model. I'm calling them conditioning phases, and working with the children and how they're thinking. And I'm looking at one central focus for all of us. The children and I were working around a trans-acquisitional task. So my supervisor is Professor Ellis, and we talk a lot about task-based learning and teaching. So there is a link there. I believe that it is the trans-acquisitional approach, and certainly in my mind, is based on language fluidity. And there I'm looking at the flow of concepts and the transfer of concepts one to the other in a reciprocal way. I am looking at simultaneous input and output. And in closing, I'm saying my thinking right now about the trans-acquisitional approach is that it is a flexible pedagogical approach. I'm looking at layers of complexity in that flexible pedagogy, working with transfer, and looking at the goals, the original goals of our Māori immersion schools, kura kaupapa Māori, that is at the end there, language revitalisation of our heritage language, but in a way that can raise achievement for our children in terms of the majority language English in our country. Tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora.
Katarina, do you want the no sound or? Okay. So the no sound. No sound. Okay, there we go. Oops. Sound. All right, let me open the other one.
Oh, it's going to play the sound. Just turn it off.
It's going to.
I want the one with no sound.
I think that's the one we had up.
And it played the sound. Turn it off.
Sorry. Want to try the other one?
Yeah.
Oops.
Oh, no, just turn it off, please.
Oh. Okay. Well, you could go through the slide.
Yeah, maybe
Yeah,
just turn
this
it
is
off.
not showing.
Turn the sound right off.
Oh, all right. You want to try now?
Yeah.
Just advance it quickly.
Thank you. Aloha kākou. I wish to start off in Hawaiian. I am living proof that immersion and one-way language is the way to go. I was brought up by grandparents who did speak English, but we only spoke Māori in the home. I went to school at 5 and we spoke English, and I, as you can hear me, am a very good speaker of English, I think. Then I went to Hawaii in 2008, and I got immersed in Hawaiian, and I have a competency in Hawaiian, and I could only go to classes. I couldn't speak English, and I learnt to speak Hawaiian. So I'm telling you, one way is the way to go, not two ways. I'm not going to go through research and quote people. Not because I'm not capable of doing it. My message here is different. Most of us involved in the revitalisation of our Indigenous languages are doing the doing. And we don't have time to do the writing and the research. It's not that we don't do it, but our priority is to get on and make sure that our languages live and survive. So no apologies for that. I could list them, but I'm not going to. But what I want you to think about here is I'm going to call them the MYLL letters. And I might actually get that turned off because it's distracting you. You're looking over there instead of listening to me. So can we turn that off, please, Dee? And I want you to think of what I've called this MMYLL, Māori, Māori medium, young language learner. And all of you in here can tell me what a second language learner is, what a native language learner is, what an Indigenous language learner is, what a foreign language learner is, what a heritage language learner is. Well, our kids in Totally Immersion Māori belong to all categories. But make no mistake, we are Māori, and despite what my colleague here is saying, I'm telling you, Māori, the reason that Māori is so successful today is because we decided that our children would learn in the medium of Māori. So I'm just going to show you, try and play you this presentation without the music. At the end of it, I will play it with the music, but the message here is quite loud and clear. Yes, please do. And if it goes faster than me, I apologise. I was there trying to make sure that I could control it, but it's not listening to me. So whakarongo means listen, pay heed, pay attention to what we want. Now this dear lady here, oh, it's not going to work for me. How can I stop it? This picture here, this moor, the picture of the bird is the moor. It's become extinct in New Zealand, and we do not want our language to become extinct. This part of the presentation is to say to our people, listen to the teachings of our ancestors. And as you see, we're not wearing grass skirts. We're actually wearing suits and ties and so on. And we are quite an educated group, really, even though you might think differently. This bottom part, and we are political, it's important. Hold fast to our language and never let it die. Speak it everywhere you can. And look at them, speaking in Māori, sports events. That's what we want to hear. That's why English survives. That's why Spanish survives. Look at noble teachings, and these are examples of traditional ways happening today. And we have a lot of traditional symposiums like that. Can you hear me? And again, hold fast to our noble language. So to my Indigenous brethren in the audience, please hold on to your language. Our language and the knowledge that is captured and encapsulated in our language is essential to our well-being. And let it cast our language to our people, to the nation, to the world. And that's why I got Clinton, because he's actually doing the traditional greeting in Māori with an elder. And these never let it die. Never let your language die. Why do you think we're all well off in here? Because English is without English, we wouldn't have jobs. Truly, think about it. Listen to the call of your language. And these are our children in total immersion settings, Māori being used out in the community. And so, we really need to listen to what our languages are saying to us. And this queer or adult lady, she is talking to the symbol represents our Ministry of Education, telling them to listen to what our people are saying. Listen to our kids learning in te reo Māori, in the Māori language. And, I want you to test my language. I want it to be researched, because without you questioning it or questioning the value of one-way immersion, it won't happen. It's a language, it's my heritage. Your language is your heritage. And so we've got generations here to symbolize that. And look at this kid. They go to karaoke, they're singing in Māori, they're speaking in Māori, riding their horses. And look at that beautiful young girl. And doing the haka. I won't ask my colleagues to do the haka because, as I said, I don't think I would do it justice. And look at all these contexts that these children are speaking Māori. It's a treasure, it's a taonga for today and future generations. Now, I don't know how my time is going, but, all I really want to say is that I've got lots of time. Wow, great. I've got lots and lots of time, so I can, I want to come back to thinking about, for everyone here to think about English, Spanish, whatever your dominant languages are, those languages are going to live. I really want you to think in how total immersion, we have to, like I said, I'm a walking, I'm a walking example of what total immersion means. And without total immersion, it really concerns me that we actually have a curriculum. Our students have a curriculum, and they can learn every content, subject area in Māori language at school. We have various levels of immersion, but the best, most successful are the children who learn in the medium of Māori. And it does concern me that we now have added English as another language. We have got some Māori immersion schools that actually have Japanese as the second language, Spanish as their second language. They go visiting other countries, and they are the most successful. Our children are all at university. They're on Māori television. We have a Māori political party. All these were initiatives from the revitalisation of the Māori language. And a lot of the people who are very successful in New Zealand are those who actually can speak Māori, whether they were native speakers of Māori, second language speakers of Māori, foreign language speakers of Māori, you name it. Most of our successful people are people who have Māori or a very strong cultural background. And I would just want to say that Professor Tamati Reedy, he was one of the earlier strong advocates for total immersion. In that citation, that when Tauwehe cited him, he was actually speaking to the non-Māori about there was nothing wrong with being bicultural. There was nothing wrong with being bilingual. He was saying, let us be Māori, let us speak Māori, and hey, it's okay for you too to get on my waka, that's my canoe, get on that waka and be Māori as well, or learn to speak Māori. Now I've got the 2-minute thing, so I do want to play this presentation now. Oops. And if you just listen to the music, I've given a simple translation. The slides actually are a translation of the words of the song.
I don't know if you're going to be able to hear this. Is there a... Yeah.
Put him into hold. And speak Māori forever. Speak your language forever. Kia ora tātou.
Okay, we have a little time for the panelists to ask questions of Tauwehe and Katarina before we open this up for a full panel debate.
Is this on? Oh, yeah. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what the English education is like in, I think it begins at the age of 11 or 12, you were saying. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that from both of you.
Kia ora. All our children speak English. English is so dominant in New Zealand that it's a struggle for us to maintain speaking Māori. We have various levels of immersion, and that's why I was saying it really disappoints me to think that we now have an English medium curriculum, but it's not compelled, it's not compulsory right now, but what I am seeing, it's easier for teachers to turn around and teach in English, and to teach English. It's all around us, and therefore, and now having a curriculum area that they have to learn in English, that's actually going to make life easier for a teacher, whereas so the Māori medium or the Māori immersion teacher, it's going to be very much easier for them to turn to speak English. And that's not, at the moment, the curriculum for other languages begins what we call year 7 and 8, which is probably towards K7, K6, 7, and from then on they have to, but our children can actually go through school all the way through in Māori. 15% of students in Māori in education, of the Māori education population, are in total immersion Māori. The rest, 85%, are in English medium classrooms.
I guess I alluded to in my 10 minutes with you, the main thing for me wasn't English. The main concern for me in my doctoral research is how do we work in our immersion Māori schools with this language in a way that preserves the Māori language, our heritage language. So what are the specialist pedagogical strategies should pre-service teacher education, that's where I work, what are these strategies that I call translingual, what translingual strategies should be included in pre-service teacher education so that our student teachers who leave our faculty are aware and able with best practice in this particular area.
When you mentioned this translingual strategy, are you talking about helping students to make use of the first language to learn the second language? Or because in your presentation it seems that you're talking about a separate English curriculum?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm an Indigenous researcher and I was facing a dilemma in our model. And so parents were saying, oh, our son, our daughter is about 10, 11, we're coming up to secondary school. He or she is proficient in our heritage language, Māori, but what about English? And so I'm looking at the CALP, that cognitive proficiency English or academic English, at that period of time when the learners are around, as I said, 10, 11, 12. Translingual, I'm looking at using our heritage language, Māori, and how to transition all that they know in Māori and to scaffold and accelerate their literacy development in English.
Okay, we're now going to open this up for the next 10 to 15 minutes or so among the panelists to share additional perspectives, say things they weren't able to say when they were presenting, and so on. I'm just going to start off by saying what I'm hearing Tauwehe and Katarina talk about is that Tauwehe, you're concerned that without more attention to English, they're not developing the academic English that they need to be successful in English in the long term. And Katarina, what I'm hearing you say is that what the programs have shown is that even with very full immersion in Māori, their English is fine. and that there's no danger of them not acquiring the academic English they need to succeed when you continue to emphasize Maori language. Am I getting that correct from both of you?
If I can just speak to that, Dee, that's right. Our children don't need to turn to speak to English. They are cognitively capable. And as I said in my short presentation, most of our children come from English-speaking backgrounds. The concern that Tauwehe is expressing is about, and I want to say to everyone, it's very easy to undermine what we're trying to achieve by turning quickly. Our parents, a lot of them are lower socioeconomic, and so they're very concerned about whether their children are going to succeed. We have some very good research. Our Ministry of Education will report that children who have gone through total immersion, when they hit their first external examinations at the age of 15, they are coping better than their English medium mainstream counterparts, because they have come through total immersion. And the research strongly says that. If you know Bishop's work, if you know Meta Berryman's work, if you know Stephen May's work, the research clearly shows that our children who have, whether they've been in total immersion or bilingual programs, the fact that they or learned Māori as a language on its own, the research clearly shows that those children are doing better than their Māori mainstream counterparts. Kia ora.
Are the assessments in English or in Māori?
They can be assessed in Māori, but the English has to be, they have to be assessed in English. And our children go to English dominant universities. They can go to a Māori university, our wānanga, but they have to be able to pass their examinations. They don't have to pass in English, but they have to meet a certain standard of English to go into the university. They're going to be a doctor or whatever, they carry out most of their university studies in English. So they are doing very well in those situations. A lot of our students come out of Māori immersion schools. They're now well qualified in most fields that we would aspire to.
I think to me, academic language is not anybody's first language. It's everybody's second language. You have to learn it. You don't acquire it. For myself, I grew up in English medium education, English immersion, and I have to say that my academic Chinese suffers. I don't think I have the same level of language, same level of, that my English proficiency in academic language is a lot better than my Chinese, unfortunately. I mean, in terms of Chinese, academic Chinese, I mean. So I'm just wondering, for academic language as a second language, does it transfer that easily?
Just to take maybe a different tangent, for me, the main thing was to be able to come at this, the pedagogical practices for the intervention, I guess, the intervention practices for English in our Māori medium schools, based first with the child, not the language. So my coming up with a Māori metaphor was to assist children to understand that just like the kahikatea trees, I talk about trees in your mind. I speak in Māori and I say, you've got trees in your mind. We all know the bush, eh? Yeah? You've got trees in your mind. And at the moment, your tree, your Māori language tree is pretty tall and strong, So, in being able to introduce another language, we're actually going to use the root system of your Māori language tree to assist in that, the next tree to grow. And together, we're going to start linking all that you know from the root system in your Māori language tree to that sapling and help it to grow. So, and the initial findings are showing that children seem to be more settled when they're working with these translingual strategies around that metaphor.
Can I just add that, like I said, English is so dominant in New Zealand. that our children, when they do get to university, sometimes in order to become a medical doctor or whatever, they will turn to speaking English. But they are already very capable speakers of English. So our concern in Māori immersion is the survival and revitalisation of Māori. But what that brings with it is the confidence and the ability to engage in the world beyond Māori as well. But they still have their heritage language and everything that goes with that. But so we're not denying them access to the English-speaking world.
It seems to me that it was common across many of the interventions this afternoon, where it was an articulation of fear of different kinds in different contexts. And one of the things that one paragraph that I didn't refer to because of time, when I was speaking, was not only the fear of English, and in fact that is a fear in Canadian French immersion programs, is the hegemony and power of English and its swallowing, its potential for swallowing up the French development. But there are also the fears that the teachers and learners do not have the self-regulation to manage a judicious use of the L1 or L1s, their L1s. And then when it comes to teachers, that fear of that they don't have the self-regulation goes beyond to question their professionalism and their training. And of course, there is evidence, research evidence out there that teachers do have. I mean, Stella actually referred to the concept of 5% gets 10%, becomes 10%, becomes 20%. In my dissertation study, I can remember one teacher who spoke English 90% of the time that I observed. So I would consider that overuse, obviously. But implicit or underlying some of this discussion are fears and questions of our collective professionalism and training. And that's problematic. And I think we need to talk that through. We have educators questioning not only educators' capacity to self-regulate, when there's ample research evidence that some L1 use is beneficial.
I wouldn't call that ample research evidence, personally. I don't think that there's been enough research in enough context to make a statement like that, personally. Right. So there.
Okay, she's opening it up for lively debate now. Okay, what is ample? Yeah. What is judicious? Yeah. What is purposeful? We certainly need more research evidence and more study, but we can continue. I think I do believe that we have evidence in different contexts, qualitative and quantitative, that is pretty suggestive that there is some benefit to L1 use, and that it's no longer totally defensible, except perhaps in some other contexts. In one way, immersion in Canada, no longer totally defensible to say that exclusive 100% L1 use.
Or L2 use.
L2 use is defensible at this stage. But my point earlier was that we have the whole professional dialogue and preparation, and to what degree are our fears of our questions of professionalism getting in the way of advancing this dialogue?
I would just add that it may not be ample to draw any conclusions, but it's certainly ample to follow up and look into it more seriously with future research. I think Fred had his hand up. Yeah.
Hold on just a second. I need to ask about how we're going to handle the microphone situation, because shall I just take one of these microphones to include people in the audience now? I need some advice from the video.
the screen.
Yeah, because this is this working? Yeah. Because this is being videotaped, it's really important that everyone's comments be microphoned. So I'm going to go to Fred first and then make my way around. I'm going to get some exercise, I can tell. It's going to be good. Okay, Fred?
Jenna, you're not.
I'm sorry I missed the very first part of the panel. I was having coffee with somebody. But so my question, this may be a little bit off the mark, but first of all, it may be, and you may have, what I really wanted to say in all seriousness is that this may be a point you've already made, is that in talking about this issue, it may be necessary to really distinguish which context we're talking about, because what is desirable and effective in one context may not be desirable and or effective in another context. So having said that, within the context of one-way immersion, in French, say French immersion for English-speaking students or Spanish immersion, what is the evidence? And this is a serious question. I'm not wanting to challenge the possibility that L1 might be worth considering as an adjunct. But what actually is the evidence that that is more effective than an approach which aims to really highlight the second language? In the Canadian context, we do it almost, in Quebec in particular, the students are strongly discouraged from using English after kindergarten. I mean, it's not totally impossible, but they're strongly discouraged. So I'd like to know, what is the evidence that using English, even systematically in that context, actually does enhance their second language development or their academic achievement? Because up to this point, it seems to me we've been talking about this as a possibility that might enhance learning, but do we actually have any evidence for that? I don't know of any.
Hold on. Miles, are you going to respond to that first?
Maybe we should have the anecdote first.
Okay.
But yes, I am going to respond.
Okay.
And part of the response came during the coffee.
Okay, this really is an anecdote, but listening last night, listening today, I think it's not something that can be researched. I wish it could be, but I'm in Brazil, Portuguese native speakers, English immersion and Hebrew immersion, and I am very much a L1 is okay kind of a girl. Partially because I spend so much time with the kids, partially because they're so young and they have so many emotional needs. And I am really hesitant to get a child who's in front of me crying and screaming because the other child did whatever the other child did and say, oh, can you please tell me that in English? I'm really hesitant to do that. Okay, and so that's the situation I have. We started the second semester in August, and I immediately became very ill and have been off of work now for 2 months. And someone else is in my classroom and teaching my students, and she's a recent arrival. She doesn't speak any Portuguese at all. And even if she did, she is very much a purist. And I have not been back to talk to my students, but I have talked a lot to my assistant. And I've said, oh, wow, gosh, their English must be so much better now because she is such a purist. And she has said, they just don't talk anymore.
So you're going to respond to...
Okay, well, I'll respond. I think Deborah has a response as well.
Yep.
First of all, there are some studies that have been conducted in Canadian one-way immersion contexts that have examined, have done qualitative and quantitative analyses of the link, the usefulness of the L1 in students' development of their language skills and content skills. What counts as sufficient evidence is a big question I have, but we have qualitatively in one-way immersion studies, Swain and Lapkin, 2000, who show the role of L1 as a useful cognitive tool to it that enhances students' learning. McMillan and Turnbull have looked at, although this study was about teachers' beliefs and what was happening, but that study has examined what was happening in language classrooms and what teachers do and believe. And probably in terms of, there's Turnbull, Cormier, and Bork, that's a quantitative study that looks at links between student L1 use, and it's linked to language development and content development in science. The evidence is there are not a multitude of studies, but there is some evidence. How much is going to count? I don't know.
Yeah, and one thing I just want to say, that is with older students, some of them in late immersion contexts, and
Yes.
Swain and Lapkin was also with middle school age students, and I think we have many fewer studies with
Younger
young
than this,
children.
and the early
Deb, you
years.
wanted to add to this as well?
I did, and I sort of want to turn the question on its head a little bit. I'm also curious what evidence there is that literally strict separation of instruction has more effect in terms of acquiring an academic level of language. Regardless of the age, I think context is crucial in that question. And I think even across our panel, there's that question. I know that Stella said, you know, we really don't know if they learn fully in L1 and then fully in L2. They might actually learn better at the end of the day, but we really don't know. That also came up last night in Meryl Swain's talk, that we need to do that research that figures out how it works inside that black box, how kids are learning. It could just be that immersion contexts give them more exposure. That's what Roy Lister has said to us at a previous time. We don't really know why it is that kids seem to learn more fluency in an immersion context. It might have very little to do with them having an environment that's exclusive of their own first language. One thing, though, that's crossed all of the conversations here is that, well, especially the last ones on Indigenous education brought this to the fore, the importance of centering culture in the conversation. Especially, this is really crucial in a two-way context, especially when you have heritage speakers of the target language right there in the classroom, that if the language is centered and the culture is centered, then language learning isn't always the only concern. The culture learning is a primary concern. That emotional connection you're talking about matters for kids who come from all the cultures represented in the classroom, so that if a language can represent their culture in the classroom, then they can be represented and they can feel at home in the classroom. And so then, you know, in the context that I've been working in Texas, the teachers talk a lot more about making sure their kids are culturally at home and talking to each other than they talk about the actual language acquisition. It's less important to them that the kids learn Spanish or learn English, but that they learn to get along together and they learn to learn the academics they need. That's the goal for them. It's changing the subject a little bit, but I think that's a very important piece of the conversation.
Andrew Cohen at the University of Minnesota. Back in the early 90s, we had 5 undergraduates follow 32 kids around for 4 or 5 months in St. Paul at a Spanish immersion program, and to see what language they were actually doing math and science in. You know, so we spent 5 months, collected a lot of data, and what we found was they were languaging, and unfortunately I missed Meryl's talk last night, but they were languaging a lot in Spanish when the tasks were relatively easy, like Maria tiene 3 lápices y Carlos tiene 4, ¿cuántos juntos? That kind of thing. Simple additives, yes, but if they had to say, this one's taller than that, and then how much taller is the third person, they'd switch to English and say, wait a second, I got to figure this out. So what people haven't been talking about in the panel are the cognitive issues around which they might go back to the L1. I mean, we can talk about complexity, but we clearly found in those data that that was something. And then there's the work by Brian Tomlinson and this De Guerrero in Puerto Rico, getting students to language make a real effort, just like you'd hit a tennis ball against a wall to practice it, to actually practice and build up their inner voice in the target language. We're talking about the use of language. It's very external, isn't it? It's like saying that Warren is not Indian. I know because I can look at her, and she's clearly not Native American. I mean, it's that sort of thing. What the kids can be doing, can be languaging in English while it appears they're in French time and Spanish time, and they're not saying anything in English. But in their minds, they're still Englishing. That's the sort of thing we found. We're not having this conversation here, but in terms of trying to better understand why kids might not be as fluent in a language as they should be, given the seat time, given the number of years, it could be, and I throw it out open to the panel, that in their minds, and here's a quote from a 4th grader. He said the following. He said, in my immersion class, they tell me I need to speak Spanish, but I'm not a Mexican. In my mind, I'm an American. I'm going to do in my mind what I want to do. That was a 4th grader. That's what he told us. I'm going to do what I want to do. They can't make me think in Spanish. So let me leave it. I want to throw this open to the panel because I think this is an important, cog in the whole equation.
Well, I clearly think no matter what kind of rules or policy we have, learners are going to do what they want to do in their head. And when I would love to, I think we need research in Montreal immersion classes to see, there's an assumption that because there's a target language only policy and we assume that that's what's actually happening, I think that's probably not what's happening in a lot of classes, be there, and no matter where they are, in a bilingual environment or not. No matter, I don't think that the question of allowing or permitting. Are we silencing by saying, silencing students to articulate their thoughts about cognitively demanding content, or about their cultural identity, or about their feelings, by saying that this class is French only, and therefore keep it inside? Is that effective?
If I can just respond, it's one of our concerns for Māori immersion too, and one of the reasons I'm a proponent, I actually totally suppose that we remain in Māori, that we have a lot of children who are like you're saying, they can actually speak Māori, but they're actually speaking English in Māori. And one of the earlier Hawaiian presentations this morning talked about the pronouns in Māori and Hawaiian, where certain pronouns are inclusive in a group, in a plural form, and then there's in a dual form, and so on. And so unless those children conceptualize their thinking in the language, then in some ways they are speaking English. So we would need a lot more, I'd like to see a lot more research on that. And I can give you a simple example. In Māori, for example, our students could be learning maths, and we have certain verbal markers and whatever marker it is that says, you add one glass to another glass, you're going to get two. But what the children are using, they're using the wrong marker, so they're thinking in English and adding these two things. The maths ends up the same, but however, they're not actually conceptualizing it in Māori. So, that's something we really need to do a lot of research on. And unless you speak the language and remain in the language, then how are we going to know whether they're doing this thinking in Māori or whatever the language might be?
Hi, yes, my name is Dr. Sarah Modian. I'm the principal of Denver Language School, and I have the unique position of being a principal but also an educational psychologist. So when I think about some of the questions that have been posed here, and this is dovetailing on the gentleman, Andrew, back behind there, on his question, is we've been talking about the judicious use of the L1 in classrooms. But I guess one of my concerns that I've seen as a principal that, again, kind of drawing from my educational psychology background here, is how is that being moved forward for the development of the whole child within the school? We talk about the content, but one of the things that I've seen as a principal and as an administrator is how do we use L1 in the development of the whole child, not only in the classroom, not only in the content, but the use of the L1 in discipline. how we use it for encouraging a sense of well-being and a sense of security within our schools, and how do we create that sense of, I feel comfortable in my environment so I can learn something new. And that's one of the challenges that I'm up against right now, and I'd like to be able to hear what the panel has to say about that.
I just want to ask for clarification. You were saying the L1, do you mean the L2? How do we use the L2 to do some of these things?
We're an immersion school, and we tell ourselves that we have to stay within the language, the target language. How is then English, the dominant language, the L1, being used then judiciously, developmentally, in a very developmentally appropriate way to encourage the growth of the whole child, again, not only in the content, but also just in the whole child development within the school?
Yeah, and I'm wondering how the target language can also be used in that capacity, right? Anybody want to respond? Susan?
I just have something very simple to say about that, and I just want to refer back to, I think it was Stern 1992, and he was saying that, and he was referring to the L1 use in the L2 classroom, the foreign language classroom, and saying that these kind of decisions are up to the teacher to decide based on the context, on the student's abilities, and on their knowledge of the students. And I think it comes by a moment-by-moment basis. If you're working with young children, as you're talking about, and these kind of issues are coming up, you can see them falling apart. You have to make that decision. Is it a pedagogical goal? Is it an emotional connection goal? Or is it a language goal that I want to meet right now? And sometimes using the L1 might be something that you're using for a pedagogical or a child development goal, and you might rule out the language goal for just a moment.
I want to add a little anecdotal piece as well to this discussion. I was able to visit my first Canadian French immersion school last April. Diane set up an opportunity for me to visit a whole school immersion program, and I was talking with the kindergarten teacher and was shocked to learn that she made the decision on her own to use English exclusively for the first few months of the program because her perception was that it would cause too much anxiety in the children to learn through French. So it concerns me as a teacher educator to have teachers get these messages and then take that on their own to just say, gee, okay, that's going to be too hard for the kids or too anxiety-inducing in the kids, and so I'm going to just use the L1. That's very disconcerting.
Can I just add before the next person that we know of examples in Māori and Hawaiian children who are not Māori, not Hawaiian, who have been learning in the target language, absolutely traumatized when they realize that actually they're not Māori. or Hawaiian. So, it goes the other way too.
Well, I want to say a couple of things just to clarify. And one thing is that with all of these arguments, every argument that I personally have made, they go the other way too. It's just one of the first times that we're bringing up going in this direction in this discussion. Secondly, I want to say that I very much stand behind teachers using the minority language as much as possible. I think students absolutely need to have as much exposure to the minority language, as much practice in it as possible. But I think that they don't, I just think we need to remove this huge guilt complex that is going to be piled on their head if they have these moments where they just take a break from language learning. Yeah.
Along those same lines, I see this tension between a sort of externally imposed policies and the teacher's own developed policies. The policy implementation, as we all know, it has to occur both top down and bottom up. It's like the layers of the onion that Nancy Hornberger describes. Teachers are the ultimate arbiters of what happens in their classrooms, so our interest is in highly educating teachers to make the best decisions. We don't want to have teachers walk away with the message that you can still call your classroom an immersion language classroom and not use the language you're trying to teach. But on the other hand, we also want to trust our teachers to make the right decisions for the best learning of both language and content and socio-emotional well-being for kids, right? Okay, so that said, I have an interesting example of the use of immersion education in a very top-down policy-imposed negative way, and that is the California Proposition 227, English immersion imposition. I was a teacher at that time in California, right? And so that's the other thing that drove me to graduate school in 1999. The use of the language in the UNCE initiative was particularly interesting in context of what we're talking about here. How much is judicious use of the target language? Well, in the UNCE initiative, it said English should be overwhelmingly used in the classroom. And I was involved in a research project my first year of graduate school where we interviewed teachers about what they did post Prop 227 in their bilingual classrooms and how they used English now since they were mandated to by state law. And it was interesting to me that one district chose 63.5% because that was the amount by which the UNCE initiative had won on the ballot. And UNCE himself said that day that it won overwhelmingly. So he was explaining and defining it for them since there was very little other guidance. Now the teachers then said, well, the other 40 whatever, 37 point whatever percent, we use Spanish and we use it strongly so that we can support our children's cultural, socio-emotional well-being and academic learning in the classroom. So I think ultimately it is really up to the teachers. So we need to make sure to prepare teachers. That's my message. Yeah.
Yes, I had a couple of questions and comment, but I'll make it very brief. Okay, so I had a question to the two people from the Maori context. One, the theory that you propose, or the model rather, of the trans acquisitional, how exactly, I want to know how exactly does it differ from Cummins' interdependence linguistic hypothesis? To me, it sounds extremely similar, but I just wanted to know exactly, what are the distinctions there? And this, the question for the second person from New Zealand is, I want to know exactly where do the students, if they're completely immersed in the Maori education, at what point are they getting their academic vocabulary and academic proficiency throughout their education? And is English taught as a subject matter, not necessarily as a medium of instruction? But, where exactly is that coming from if it's, not taught at all?
You're right. Definitely. I struggled, all respect to Jim Cummins, but I definitely struggled as a Māori from the bush, all those trees I had. And I've never seen an iceberg, So I really struggled with that iceberg thing. Now, maybe that's the Indigenousness about me, but it just made better sense to go back to who I am as a Māori, where I come from in the bush. Tauwehe is my tribe, and it made better sense that trees are organic. They grow. The roots are all twisted and all matted, and that's kind of what it looked like in me when I was thinking about my own language learning. That it's not this kind of straight lines around an iceberg. It's complicated. It's got layers to it. It changes, it twists and turns. So that's kind of why I settle better. And before I came over here, about 2 weeks I was working with children to help and add. So I'm working with Māori immersion children in Akura Kaupapa Māori. Their average age is 12. And one of them said to me after reading a target text in English, Fire, I'm reading in English and I can understand it in Māori. And that really happened. And so the next thing was to be able to give them space, that they're used to cameras now and digital recorders, and record each other, talk to each other about what's going on in the root system, the linguistic root system in the head. How are the concepts flowing? I hope that helps.
Okay, to your second question, we have 4 levels of immersion in New Zealand, And in the level 1 immersion, it's 80-20. Now, schools can either choose to stay in Māori medium, using Māori as the target language, or they can use some of that 20% if they feel that their children need some transition classes in English. So that's how we cope with that. And then later on in their learning, they can actually take English as a subject.
Tara, you had a comment or question?
I guess I just have a series of questions that are striking me as I'm listening to this, and I'm so thrilled that we're having this conversation because I think it's an important one, and it's one that really impacts classroom and program practice, and I think the implications of this conversation are enormous for those of us that are still trying to grow language immersion, dual language and immersion education for children. Here's some of my questions. I think my biggest question really is, after all the time that I spend in classrooms and working with teachers, my biggest question is, what evidence is there that English is not being used in classrooms during minority language instructional time by students? That's my question number one, because I have no evidence of that. Whether they're doing it vocally, subvocally, I am convinced that students are using their L1. I haven't seen evidence of dual language and immersion contexts where that's not occurring. A question I would love to see researchers explore: how important is it to become capable of languaging in the L2? We've looked at examples of languaging and the importance of languaging in the L1. But my question is, can we find evidence of languaging in the L2? What does that look like? And what do we need to do to promote that? Another question: how many non-linguistic ways are there to silence? Do we only silence by silencing language? I would argue that very much of communication happens non-verbally, and I believe and experience in my life the power of silencing in many ways that do not have verbal expression. And I think as teachers we need to become very aware of that. And finally, I will say that I know one thing that has really resonated with teachers and administrators, district leaders that I've worked with over many years now, is the concept of how critical it is to adopt a mindset within our immersion programs and dual language programs where we're coming from a frame of privileging minority languages and cultures. And for me, that's a principle that needs to undergird our decision-making in terms of what we do in practice. It's a principle. Are we privileging minority languages and cultures? How are we doing that? How does that work in our classrooms? Because that's a core message, I think, that we're trying to be about. Thanks. Comments? Yes, some responses to some of those issues? If at all? I know there's a hand back here. There's someone behind you that's in line first, sorry.
So while she's walking, I'll quickly respond to the languaging question. Just from my own experience with my own language learning, I could language in my second language once my skills in the language became advanced enough to reach that cognitive level of discourse. And I think it's an ongoing, we're never actually completely done learning language, of course, so I don't think we're ever done learning to language either. We use the languaging skills in whatever language we're languaging with someone in, right? Yeah. Or languages. And our primary bilinguals in Texas language in both their languages. And we see that across language groups in a two-way program where an English-only speaker will language in English and
Spanish-only speaker will language back in Spanish, and the bilingual speaker will just do both. And I think we continue to develop our language skills at the abstract level by pushing ourselves to language in all the languages we have.
All right, two things. First of all, Tara, thank you for those really insightful questions. I think that those are really important questions to be asking. I want to talk quickly to just two components of this. First of all, to language status, and then secondly, to linguistic and cognitive competency. I think, first of all, regarding language status, like you said, Tara, we have to do everything possible to privilege the minority language in our classrooms. I'm speaking from a one-way context. I'm a second grade immersion teacher, and our school did implement a policy 4 years ago. And as I hear you talk about policy, it tends to have a negative feel to it, you know, this top-down policy and whatnot, which I understand. However, we had an incredibly positive experience in our immersion program once our policy was implemented. And what happened was, prior to the implementation of this policy, teachers wanted to use the L2 as much as possible. They wanted the kids to know as much L2 as possible. However, they didn't believe it. They didn't believe they could reach that cognitive competency and linguistic competency. So what happens as normal, everybody kind of lowered the bar a little bit, and kids would use the L1 a lot, or not a lot, but significantly, and the teachers would every once in a while. And finally, it came together when our administrators were using research to say we need to be able to have them reach this cognitive competency later, so we have to front load incredible linguistic instruction and foundations, and we have to raise the bar for that. At the same time, the message the kids will get is that we love and treasure the minority language. So we went about doing it in an incredibly positive way, and I was able to be there as a teacher in my first year in the implementation process. And we threw parties, and kids came up with ideas, and we had ice cream parties, and Stacy, our coordinator, brought in her little dog dressed up as a dragon, because one class wanted a dragon to visit their classroom if they spoke only the minority language. And what happened is that it worked, and it was amazing, and we drew pie charts, and I remember just saying, kids, let's draw out your summer. What language do you speak? English, okay? Colored in a chunk of the pie chart. What do you speak after school? Colored in a chunk of the pie chart. What do you speak during lunch? Colored in a chunk of the pie chart, because we're a strand program. And I said, look at this tiny sliver. This is all we have. Let's maximize it, you know? Do it in your mind. Do it with your friends. And motivation just skyrocketed. And then they started to realize, wow, this is really valuable. And honestly, we spent, I would say, 1.5 years of just really promoting. And I teach second grade now. And our policy is that after day 1 of second grade, it is Spanish only. And I never, ever give consequences to kids for not speaking in Spanish. It happens so rarely. And when it does, it's an oops, or it's a slip, or it's a word that just falls out because that's their only reference they have for it. You know, balance beam, something that they learned in gymnastics, and it kind of balance, but whatever. So I'm just saying, I've had incredibly positive experiences. We've seen our reading scores go up immensely since we put that policy in place. In both, oh yes, important. We have seen, I'm finishing my master's, I just did my final project, collecting the last 6 years of our first grade reading scores in English and in Spanish. And our Spanish scores went through the roof, obviously, because we started expecting a ton more of the kids in Spanish. Their vocabulary went up, their grammar, all of that went up, so their reading scores went up. And then this little side bonus is their English scores went up. We had in the years previous, prior to the implementation of this policy, our average students in the spring that reached our grade level benchmark expectation for our English medium students was only 30%. And at the end, for the next 2 groups of students, so that covers a 4-year span, post-timeline implementation, it was at 64 and 61%, passing English.
She just gave our whole presentation away.
Thank you very much. I think that's really important information to have. Elizabeth, and then I'm going to walk over that way. We are running low on time. If people need to leave, certainly feel free to do so, but we're going to try to squeeze it out and continue a little bit more.
Well, I'm glad to follow this very enthusiastic young teacher, because I want you, Tara, to add to the nonverbal communication piece that there are lots of ways to comfort a kindergartner or a first grader non-verbally and then stay in the target language. I don't work with the little guys, they kind of scare me, but I've seen my colleagues do that very effectively, and I feel when the target language is really well maintained and they get up to the middle grade levels, they can't stop themselves from having cognition in both of their languages. They can't stop it, and we see it at the middle school level when they're in we're a strand program, so when they're mixed with the students who are not immersion students, they forget to filter and stop using their Spanish in those contexts. That said, I think at the upper levels, where we're trying really hard to make sure that we keep the cognitive level high, then I can see the arguments from the camp of some judicial use of looking at false cognates in mathematics, or some judicial linguistic awareness techniques that pull in a little bit of both languages might be called for.
I don't think that anyone on this panel or in the room is saying, let's use a bunch of L1. And I don't think anyone is saying that, there are lots of positive strategies that can help teachers in a variety of contexts to stay in the target language, to comfort students, to enhance comprehension, etc. I think we're saying that there is a maybe, okay, I'll withdraw ample. Okay, I learned that lesson. There is some research evidence that's suggesting that there is a role, a potential role. Well, I think no, it's more than potential. That does enhance learning. And it's a question of continuing to this dialogue and the research to tease out what is optimal.
So I'd like to make a, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, you.
Okay. Well, I just want to follow up on that. I mean, the issue of whether the evidence is ample or not. It has more to do with what I think we need evidence of is that we need to look at the kind of scaffolding that teachers need to engage in the second language so that students have the right kind of support in order to engage in these higher cognitive, higher level thinking skills that we want them to engage in while using the second language. So in some of the studies that do show that use of the L1 has been a useful tool, I want to know, is that only because they lack the kind of scaffolding they really required to rely on the second language? I think there are lots of pedagogical questions related to teacher scaffolding. So that's my comment. I also had a question too. So my question was, it's changing topics just a little bit. It's for Tauwehe from University of Auckland. Yeah, because you mentioned that you're interested in pre-service. And so, so many of these issues have to do with teacher education and teacher training, right? And I was very interested in what you referred to in terms of looking for the instructional strategies that teachers can use to help students in their English development in a way that in no way jeopardizes what they've learned in their minority language. And from what I understand from what you said, it has a lot to do with their metalinguistic awareness and so on. And if I understand correctly, your thesis is about identifying those instructional strategies. And I'm wondering if you're at a point where you could reveal what some of those instructional strategies might be.
Well, one that the children really enjoy is called Te reti kupu. And reti means to slide or slip and slide, and or surf. And kupu means words, so they love word surfing. That's one technique that I've come up with. And word surfing is where three things need to happen when they're given either a target text in English or a target text in Māori. And that is, they need to make the decision on which phrases or words they want to identify as going forward on in terms of learning a bit more about. The second thing they need to do is justify why they want to learn that word or phrase and talk about it with their peers. And the third is go away and do that and then come back and report. So across those 3 stages of that conditioning phase, they're starting to think about their thinking, and they're starting to say things on tape about what it means to look at something, you know, through their Māori language and how that shapes the understanding in English. So they're very interesting conversations that I'm having, but all the transcribing is happening as we speak. It's exciting times for me, you know, and I guess I started it to say English is huge in our country. So as a pre-service teacher, lecturer, I guess if I'm honest, my main motivation was to look at English and say, I want to manage you in a way that is culturally sensitive to me and my people. So, you know, words are cheap. So, you know, my colleagues, I think she said it pushed her to study further. Well, that's what I'm doing my PhD on. Good, so it definitely pushed me.
Thank you. Good luck with that.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about the word judicious. I fear that it was actually introduced by myself and Sharon Lapkin in an article that we wrote in 2000 when we talked about the judicious use of the L1. And everybody's picked it up and they're using it as if it has meaning. And I don't... So I want to first of all apologize for the use of that. And I hope we stop using it. And I'd like to say that in the guiding principles that I presented last night, for those of you that were there, I probably presented that to about 20 different people involved in immersion education in the local setting. And every single word in those guiding principles were thought through very carefully in the way in which it was said. And one of the words that I use is purposeful use of the L1, which when I worked very hard to get rid of the word judicious. And then I used the word planned use. And interestingly, all the teachers said, not a good word. And why not a good word? Because it's fine to say, yes, I plan to do this. But in the everyday moment of classroom activity, nothing ever happens exactly like it was planned. And so they really suggested I try to use another word, but we couldn't come up with another one. And you'll notice the word that I did use. The word's purposeful. And I feel, at least at this point in time, maybe 10 years from now, I'll be apologizing for it. But the word purposeful, what that means to me is that you, the teacher, or you, the teacher educator, or whoever it is that's involved, can justify the use. So we don't want random use of the L1. We don't want lots, and we don't want little. We want quality use of the L1. And that's what's behind the word purposeful. Purposeful means that you can tell me after the fact why you used the L1. So that's really a clarification, and I'd really like us to stop using the word judicious, because it doesn't mean anything.